and we are venturing to talk about African mental health, beginning with non-African centered models. And in the next unit, we'll discuss African centered models. The question in this mini-series is that of what is optimal mental health for African people in America. What does it mean for African people to be mentally healthy? So, when we deal with African-centered models of Black personality, African-centered human sciences have posited clear parameters for optimal mental health or African psychological normalcy. These theorists, who we reviewed in a previous mini-series, argue that African psychological normalcy is rooted in African worldview, African concepts of cultural identity, and rooted in that, the foundation of that is spirituality, collectivism, and even rhythm. So, in understanding who African people are, the question is, especially in African Black psychology, is what is African psychological, what is healthy African psychological functioning? And all of the theorists, even non-psychologists, argue that African people, the paradox, the basic psychological paradox for African people is that African people wear a mask. We have to oftentimes operate in this duality of operating from an African cultural perspective and being African, but wearing a white mask to reflect the European or Eurocentric cultural reality that we're engaged in. So these theorists sought to understand what are models of African mental health that reflect the most optimal functioning for African people. The non-Afrocentric models emphasize oftentimes European survival, meaning the European survival thrust. In these non-Afrocentric models, they emphasize that African mental health is connected to the European survival thrust as a defining criteria for articulating mental health. So for African people, their identity is rooted in self-hate, and they utilize Black self-hatred models under these pure Eurocentric approaches to understand African mental health. And so again, with this Black self-hatred, the argument is that Black people don't like themselves, again, connected to that mark of oppression in the history, only starting inside the history of enslavement of African people, and that African people only progress past enslavement, so they see themselves as negative and operate from a deficit in these pure Eurocentric or non-Afrocentric models. Deficit meaning that African people don't function inside of their African minds and see the world from a European or Eurocentric worldview perspective, which introduces then this pseudo-Afrocentric approach. And we introduced the gentlemen, the two brothers, Greer and Cobb. They wrote a book. Oh, that little dot is out of order. So their work tended to be consistent with the psychoanalytic theory, where they emphasize a conflict between the inner drives and the inner self and this push for gratification. They argued the principle of Black psychological function is universal. And in that, we can see some more psychoanalytic theory with the utilization of defense mechanisms to cope with European domination and control. Too fast on that one. Also, in Greer and Cobb's pseudo-Afrocentric approach, they defined a couple of terms. And these terms are actually still used and useful today to understand how Black folks operate in their understanding of Black mental health. Again, historically from the Greer and Cobb's model, I believe it was around the 70s. They say the Black norm emphasizes this notion of cultural paranoia, where whites are seen as a potential enemy. That Blacks develop this depression or this cultural depression of this sadness and intimacy with misery because of this historic sense of hurt and continuous ongoing sense of wrongness vis-a-vis things like racism and racial discrimination that Black people experience. So the idea in the pseudo-Afrocentric approach is that African people, Black folks, are just depressed paranoid, and masochist. And this is where we experience psycho-emotional hurt as a characteristic of being African in America. And Black people learn to live with it in spite of, or live in spite of, this cultural masochism. Additionally, Greer-and-Cobb identified as Black cultural anti-socialism, where Black people don't experience the breaking of unfair and unjust white American laws and ethical codes as morally reprehensible. So when we deal with this notion of the models for Greer-and-Cobb, they're seemingly operating from a negative, pejorative, and even sometimes a deficit perspective in their analysis of African personality and African mental health. So that moves us then to the transitional African or Afrocentric models of Black mental health. In each one of these, separate from the pseudo-Afrocentric models of African personality, these don't locus their analysis within an African cultural worldview context. And remember, in all of this work, centering an African worldview context makes the theoretical perspective African-centered. So some might even be challenged to see Cress Welsing there, but she did not locus her analysis in African worldview perspective. So we'll talk about Nathan Hare, Frantz Fanon, Philip McGee, and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's work. Starting out with Nathan Hare's model, he analyzed African people. So remember, all of this work is to understand the African personality and understand African mental functioning, to understand what is optimal or normal functioning for African people. Nathan Hare looked at African psychopathology, and he came up with these lists of challenging behaviors or behaviors that African people have that are psychopathological in nature. Again, it's moving us towards a more clear understanding of who African people are. He begins with the dignitaries. These are Black leaders who are appointed by whites who think they are or express themselves as being better than other Black folks because of their appointments. The image makers are those who display proper Anglo-Saxon manners, meaning, the fork goes on this side, the spoon goes on that side. The cultured, degreed, or credentialed are those who believe that they are better than others because of their degree, their credentials. The sociable are the party hosters, those who host parties. The possessors are the ones who acquire, kind of like the keeping up with the Joneses. The possessors are the ones who want to have the newest cars, the biggest houses, and they feel like that is what makes them have arrived to have some sort of social clout. But based on Nathan Hare's model, he calls that African psychopathology. The exile or the separation from the Black world, meaning they do not engage in or deal with Black folks because they don't want to be connected to anything related to the Black world. The insiders, super citizens, and the pioneers. And last but not least, we have the cosmopolitans, who are the cultural universalists, who believe that there are no distinct cultures and that everything should fit, not universally, but inside European or Eurocentric culture. Therefore, there's no need to differentiate between what's Black and what is not. So Nathan Hare's research was actually very dynamic. And that leads us to introducing the work of Frantz Fanon. You will have a discussion board on Frantz Fanon, so where we watch a video or two on him. He was a forerunner of the modern African Black psychological movement. We introduced Fanon earlier in this term. His orientation was still psychoanalytic in nature and sociodynamic. He discussed the existential model of African mentality being under the influence of European colonial processes of cultural oppression and indoctrination. So he understood that African people were oppressed, indoctrinated, and that we had to struggle over discovering our own African cultural identity. And a very important quote from Frantz Fanon is that the fatal error, he argued, was that the African is seeing the white man as a human being, and asking him to see the Black man as a human being. Say that again. So Fanon wrote books such as The Wretched of the Earth, very important work. He was a psychoanalyst and he dealt with and studied the problems of racism in the world, and he wanted to understand why folks were so racist towards African people, what was the challenge and the goal. So he again argued that the fatal error is seeing the white man as a human being, and asking him to see the black man as a human being. So Fanon's work was very, very important because of his work in emphasizing that we must see and engage in a struggle for discovering our identity. Philip McGee talked about white conditioning of black dependency. He identified black mental health being based on black cultural oppression and challenged the understanding of American culture seeing blackness as the damage that it did to us and not the joy that we take in being ourselves. He discussed that in his analysis, black people saw that being good was having more resources, and that was, more parallel with being white. Being bad, less resources, more so paralleled with being black. And that was one of the challenges of black mental health, that black folks struggled with this conditioning and this dependency. Last, we'll look at Frances Cress Welsing's work, and you all have been introduced quite well to Cress Welsing's work. But one of the important parts of this analysis of mental health from Cress Welsing's perspective was this idea that African people saw the image of themselves as inferior. And African people, based on, in this mental health paradigm, saw themselves as inferior because of the promotion in the media of the religious imagery of God as being white. And this utilization of conditioning was successful, and that European society gained control over African people's consciousness through religious imagery, religious indoctrination over Africans. And that caused the African then to depreciate themselves and accept what is known as an inferiority complex, which reflect a poor mental state for the African. So when the African looks in the mirror, they don't see an African, they see what is supposed to be ideal for the European. So we'll stop here with Cress Welsing's model, and we'll pick up with the Afrocentric models of black mental health. Remember, we did transitional, pseudo-Afrocentric, and non-Afrocentric. I am Dr. Slater Sarah. Till next time, peace.